Eleanor Vance lived her life in meticulously curated order. Her apartment, a minimalist haven of beige and muted greys, overlooked a quiet, tree-lined street in a respectable, if somewhat dull, part of the city. Her days as a senior archivist at the city library were governed by the Dewey Decimal System and the hushed reverence of historical documents. Noise, chaos, and unpredictability were anathema to her, which was why Marcus Mac Thorne, her neighbor in 3B, was a constant, throbbing irritation. Mac was, in Eleanor's carefully considered opinion, an assault on the senses. His appearance was a collage of what she deemed unfortunate choices: faded band t-shirts stretched over a burly frame, ripped jeans, a collection of silver rings on calloused fingers, and a formidable, often unruly dark beard. Tattoos snaked up his arms, disappearing beneath his sleeves, their cryptic imagery hinting at a life Eleanor couldn't and wouldn't want to comprehend. But it was the music, the relentless, guttural roar of heavy metal or some equally aggressive genre that truly grated on her nerves. It would erupt from his apartment at unpredictable hours, a sonic battering ram against the fragile peace of her evenings and weekends. The bass vibrated through her floorboards, rattling the delicate porcelain teacups in her china cabinet, a physical manifestation of the disruption he represented. Eleanor had perfected the art of avoidance. If she saw him in the hallway, she'd develop a sudden urgent need to check her mailbox, or her pace would quicken, eyes fixed firmly ahead. Polite, distant nods were the extent of their interaction, though even those felt like a concession. She judged him, silently and severely, as a man who clearly had no respect for common courtesy, for shared living spaces, for the sanctity of quiet. He was, in her mind, the epitome of inconsiderate. Her colleagues at the library sometimes shared stories of their own neighbourly woes, and Eleanor would offer a sympathetic ear, all the while thinking that none of them could truly understand the auditory torment she endured. She'd even drafted polite but firm notes, only to crumple them, fearing a confrontation would be worse than the noise itself. He seemed the type to be belligerently defensive. One blustery Saturday afternoon, Eleanor was returning from her weekly grocery run, juggling bags filled with organic vegetables and artisanal bread. The wind whipped fallen leaves into frantic spirals around her ankles. As she approached the entrance to their building, a small, pitiful whimper cut through the urban hum. She paused, scanning the overgrown patch of shrubbery near the steps. There, huddled against the cold stone, was a tiny ginger kitten. It was shivering violently, one of its back legs twisted at an unnatural angle, its eyes, huge and green. She paused, scanning the overgrown patch of shrubbery near the steps. There, huddled against the cold stone, was a tiny ginger kitten. It was shivering violently, one of its back legs twisted at an unnatural angle, its eyes, huge and green. Eleanor's meticulously ordered world fractured. Her first instinct was an academic one: observe, assess. Her second, more human, was a pang of distress. But before she could decide on a course of action, call animal control, try to approach it herself. A large shadow fell over her. It was Mac. He was dressed in his usual weekend attire, a black hoodie with some indecipherable jagged lettering and torn jeans. For a horrifying moment, Eleanor imagined he might kick the creature or make some crude remark. Her hand tightened on her grocery bag, bracing herself. Instead, Mac knelt. The movement for such a large man was surprisingly gentle. He said nothing, his gaze fixed on the injured kitten. He extended a large tattooed hand, palm up, moving with a slowness that belied his rough exterior. "Hey there, little fighter," he murmured, his voice a low rumble, startlingly different from the aggressive vocals that usually emanated from his apartment. It was soft, almost tender. The kitten flinched but didn't try to bolt. Mac kept his hand still, letting the animal scent him. Eleanor watched, frozen, a strange conflict warring within her. This was not the man she had constructed in her mind. With infinite patience, Mac slowly edged closer. He began to speak to the kitten in a soothing stream of nonsense, his tone more comforting than any words could have been. Then, with an expertise that stunned Eleanor, he carefully, almost reverently, scooped up the tiny creature. He cradled it against his chest, one hand supporting its injured leg, the other gently stroking its head. Poor little mite. Leg's definitely broken. Needs a vet, stat, he said, looking up at Eleanor for the first time. His eyes, which she'd always perceived as hard and challenging, now seemed filled with a concerned warmth. Eleanor could only stare, her carefully constructed judgments crumbling like ancient parchment. I didn't know what to do, she stammered, feeling a flush of shame creep up her neck. Not everyone does. Got a carrier in my place, I'll take him. Can you grab my door? My keys are somewhere. Mac gave a curt nod. He shifted the kitten slightly. Numbly, Eleanor fumbled with her own keys, found his apartment, and pushed open the door. The inside, she noted with a strange sense of dislocation, was surprisingly tidy. Yes, there were posters of bands she didn't recognize and a formidable stereo system, but it was clean, organized in its own way. No beer cans littered the floor, no overflowing ashtrays, just a home. Numbly, Eleanor fumbled with her own keys, found his apartment, and pushed open the door. The inside, she noted with a strange sense of dislocation, was surprisingly tidy. Yes, there were posters of bands she didn't recognize and a formidable stereo system, but it was clean, organized in its own way. No beer cans littered the floor, no overflowing ashtrays, just a home. Mac strode past her, still murmuring to the kitten. He retrieved a pet carrier from a closet, lined it with a soft towel, and gently placed the injured animal inside. Willow Creek Animal Hospital. They know me there. He grabbed a worn leather wallet and his keys. Thanks, he said, already halfway out the door. Eleanor stood in his doorway, groceries forgotten in the hallway, her mind reeling. The dissonance was overwhelming. The man who subjected her to sonic torture, the man she'd labeled a public nuisance, had just displayed a depth of compassion she wouldn't have believed possible. The following week was different. The music still played, perhaps a decibel or two lower, or maybe Eleanor's perception had shifted. When she heard it, instead of annoyance, a flicker of curiosity arose. What kind of man was Mac, really? A few days later, a small typed note appeared under her door. Kitten's doing okay, legs in a cast, they're calling him lucky. Thanks for your help. Mac. Eleanor found herself smiling. She bought a small get-well-soon card with a picture of a cartoon cat on it, hesitated for a full day, then slipped it under his door with a bag of gourmet cat treats. The next Saturday, driven by an uncharacteristic impulsiveness, Eleanor found herself walking in the direction of Willow Creek Animal Hospital. It was a considerable distance, but the need to understand, to reconcile the two versions of Mac Thorne, propelled her forward. She didn't go in. Instead, she lingered across the street, feeling like a spy. After about an hour, she saw him emerge. He wasn't alone. He was laughing with one of the veterinary nurses, then bent down to give an enthusiastic greeting to a golden retriever being led out by its owner. He seemed happy, at ease. As she walked home, a new thought began to form. She started paying more attention, not just to the noise, but to Mac's comings and goings. She noticed he often left early on Saturday and Sunday mornings, usually carrying a couple of large nondescript duffel bags, and returned late in the afternoon looking tired but content. The puzzle pieces weren't fitting. Her carefully catalogued image of him was in tatters. The puzzle pieces weren't fitting. Her carefully catalogued image of him was in tatters. The true revelation came a month later. It was a Sunday, and Eleanor had decided to donate some old blankets to a local animal shelter she'd read about online Paws and Whiskers sanctuary. The address, when she looked it up, was in an industrial part of town, an unlikely place for saving graces. When she arrived, it was a modest, slightly ramshackle building, but clean, and filled with the sounds of barking and meowing. A young woman with kind eyes greeted her. As Eleanor handed over the blankets, she heard a familiar low voice from a back room. "All right, you little rascal. Hold still. This won't hurt a bit." Eleanor froze. She peered through the open doorway. There was Mac, wearing surgical gloves and a faded Paws and Whiskers volunteer t-shirt, patiently cleaning the ears of a grumpy-looking Persian cat. Surrounding him were cages and enclosures, each holding an animal looking at him with varying degrees of trust and affection. The room was a symphony of quiet care, Mac murmuring to a nervous terrier, carefully measuring out food, his large hands surprisingly deft as he administered medication to a recuperating pigeon in a small cage. The duffel bags she'd seen him carry were there, likely filled with supplies. The young woman smiled. "Oh, that's Mac. He's our weekend rock star. Practically runs this place on Saturdays and Sundays. Founded it, actually, about 5 years ago after he found a box of abandoned puppies. Uses his own money mostly, fundraisers when he can. He's incredible with them. They all adore him." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her. Founded it? Runs it? The man whose loud music she'd cursed, whose appearance she'd scorned, was a quiet hero, dedicating his weekends to rescuing the forgotten and unloved. The rough exterior, the tattoos, the thundering music. They were just the cover of a book whose contents were profoundly beautiful. She watched him for a few more moments, saw him gently coax a frightened, three-legged dog out of its cage for a short walk, his voice a constant, reassuring balm. The tenderness in his interaction with these creatures was palpable, a stark contrast to the aggressive soundscape he created in his apartment. Perhaps, she mused, the music was his release, his way of decompressing from the emotional weight of his selfless work. Or maybe it was simply what he liked, and it had no bearing on the kindness in his soul. Eleanor left Paws and Whiskers Sanctuary that day with more than just a receipt for her donation. She left with a profound sense of humility and a deep, aching shame for her years of silent, baseless judgment. Eleanor left Paws and Whiskers Sanctuary that day with more than just a receipt for her donation. She left with a profound sense of humility and a deep, aching shame for her years of silent, baseless judgment. The next evening, as the familiar chords of some metallic anthem began to vibrate through her floor, Eleanor didn't cringe. She didn't reach for her earplugs. Instead, she closed her eyes and pictured Mac with the ginger kitten, with the grumpy Persian, with the three-legged dog. She walked over to her own door, took a deep breath, and knocked on 3B. Mac opened it, looking surprised. He was wearing a Megadeth t-shirt. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps embarrassment, or just surprise at being discovered. He said, rubbing the back of his neck. He shrugged, a hint of a smile playing on his lips beneath the beard. Eleanor's voice echoed in her mind. "I was wondering if you ever need an extra pair of hands. I'm good at organizing, and I'm not afraid of hard work." She continued, the words feeling foreign but right. Mac looked at her, truly looked at her, for a long moment. The thumping bass from his apartment seemed to soften, or perhaps it was just that Eleanor no longer heard it as noise, but as the soundtrack to a life far richer and more compassionate than she could ever have imagined. He said, his smile widening, revealing a kindness that had been there all along. hidden only by her own preconceived notions. She replied. As Eleanor returned to her apartment, the music from 3B seemed to wrap around her not as an assault, but as an invitation. She had spent years judging a book by its cover, only to discover its pages were filled with a story of profound kindness and quiet heroism. And in that discovery, Eleanor Vance found her own carefully ordered world beautifully, irrevocably, and wonderfully rearranged.